The north is cold and full of whispers.
The candles in the twins burned warm, and the arbor gold flowed, and the music was too loud for a man to think, which was exactly what Robb Stark needed people to believe. He was laughing. He had been laughing for 3 hours. He laughed at Edmure's stories and at Walder Frey's strained attempts at warmth from the far end of the table. He raised his cup when the toasts demanded it and drank when the cup reached his lips, but only a sip, never a swallow, and the man beside him who kept refilling it did not know that the cup was always almost full. Robb Stark was 17 years old. He had commanded armies across half of Westeros. He had never worked harder in his life than he was working now. On his right, Talisa. She wore a dress the color of winter moss, and her hand rested on the swell of her belly, and she smiled when Robb leaned close to whisper something that looked like a husband's intimacy and was in fact a battlefield instruction. On his left, Catelyn. His mother had said nothing since they sat down. She smiled when eyes turned to her. She did not touch her wine. Under the table, her hands were folded in her lap, and her knuckles were white. 3 days ago, a Lannister courier had been taken by Tully outriders on the road north of Seaguard. The man had not wanted to give up his satchel. He had been persuaded. Catelyn had read the letter by candlelight in a cold room at Riverrun, alone. The words in Tywin Lannister's careful hand running down the page like a verdict already delivered. She had read it twice. Then she had folded it with steady hands and gone to find her son. Robb had read it standing. He read it once. He handed it back, without looking up. He said, "Then we do not attend a feast. We set a trap." Now the trap was set. It had been assembled across 3 days, one careful layer at a time. Trusted men given quiet orders in the gray hours before dawn. Blades distributed beneath silk and wool and wedding attire. Captains outside the walls briefed on the signal and what it meant, and what they were to do the moment it came. The maester of the twins had been located, the rookery found, the exits mapped. And Grey Wind, when the Frey gateman had demanded the direwolf be kennelled as a condition of entry, speaking as though the request were a formality, Robb had smiled and declined. "He rides with me," he had said, as though this were a preference rather than a decision. Grey Wind was outside the outer walls now with Dacy Mormont's man, on a long lead, and he had been pulling at it since they arrived. Robb watched the hall through the corner of his eye the way his father had once taught him to watch a tree line, without looking directly at the thing he was watching. He watched Roose Bolton. Bolton sat 3 seats down from Walder Frey at the high table, a cup untouched before him, still in the particular way that a man is still when he is not at rest, but waiting. He wore gray silk. Robb had noticed, when they arrived and the torchlight moved across Bolton's chest, a heaviness to the silk that did not hang right. It did not move the way fabric moved. It moved the way mail moved. Robb had said nothing. He had laughed at another of Edmure's stories. The musicians in the gallery above the hall had been playing for hours. Frey songs and Riverlands ballads and a Reach tune that nobody below seemed to know. Now the lead musician, a gray-haired man with very careful eyes, glanced down from the gallery to the high table. Lord Walder Frey gave one small nod, a chin drop. Nothing more. The first notes of the Rains of Castamere rose into the smoky air of the twins. Robb heard it before the second bar. Every northern man in the hall had been told exactly what sound to listen for. Near the main doors, a Frey servant rose from his bench with one hand already reaching for the bar. He made it to his feet. 1 step. A Stark blade was at his throat before he took the second, held by a household man who had been sitting beside that door all evening for this exact moment. The servant opened his mouth. The blade pressed. The sound stopped. At the gallery stairs on the eastern wall, 4 Stark archers who had spent the feast sitting quietly against the stone, their cups nursed, their weapons invisible, stood at once and moved. Robb rose. He stood the way he stood in the field before a charge, straight through the spine, weight settled, both feet planted on ground that his body was already claiming. He looked down the full length of the table at Walder Frey. At the ancient face, the wet small eyes, the mouth still open from the nod he had just given his musicians. Walder Frey. Robb's voice carried the hall from end to end. No heat in it. no shake. The voice of a man who decided how this ended 3 days ago and has simply been waiting to say so. I have read your letter. The hall stopped. For one long second, every man in it ceased moving, ceased drinking, ceased laughing, ceased being certain what was happening or what it meant. In that second, Stark men reached inside their clothes. Then, everything moved at once. The Frey crossbowmen in the gallery had their weapons half raised when the first Stark arrow hit the gallery floor. Then, the second. The stairs had been taken in the first 10 seconds, not stormed, not fought for, simply taken. Because Robb's archers had been sitting against that wall for 3 hours, and the Frey guards on the steps had been watching the feast below, not the quiet men beside them. The bolts that did fire went into the ceiling, into the rushes, into nothing. The gallery fell before it could empty itself into the hall below. On the floor, it was not a battle. It was several smaller fights happening at the same moment in a room designed for eating. Frey guards drew steel from sheaths, while Stark men were already in motion. The noise was total, benches going over, cups ringing off stone, blades catching the candlelight in short bright arcs. Roose Bolton did not panic. He rose from his seat with his blade already clear, and he fought the way cold men fight. No wasted movement, no expression, nothing given away. He put his blade into the shoulder of the first Stark man who reached him, and drew a long cut down the forearm of the second, before the third came in low. Greatjon Umber's warhammer connected behind Bolton's knee with a sound like green wood splitting. Bolton went down hard onto his side. He tried to rise. The Greatjon put a boot square on his chest and looked down at him with the patience of a man who has been keeping it for a very long time. King set alive, the Greatjon said. Decide how serious you think he meant it. Bolton's blade arm relaxed. The calculation behind his gray eyes went on. At the far end of the high table, Walder Frey had decided, in the last moment available to him, that he would run. He was ancient and infirm and soft with age, and he still tried. He made 3 steps from his chair before Sir Brynden Tully's hand closed on the back of his collar. The Blackfish lifted him the way you lift something that doesn't deserve ceremony. The old man shrieked, something that might have been a name or a curse, and kicked at air. Your song's over, the Blackfish said, and pulled him back. Outside the walls, through stone and smoke and the dying sound of steel, Grey Wind's howl cracked the night open. He had been pulling at the lead for the better part of an hour, and now the lead was gone. The sound of him in that courtyard, an animal the size of a destroyer moving in the dark, did what swords sometimes cannot. Men stopped thinking about the fight they had been sent to win, and started thinking about the distance to the nearest gate. The outer gates of the twins fell without a siege. Robb walked the length of the hall afterward. Overturned candles had scorched black rings into the rushes before his men stamped them out. The sweetness of the wine was gone under smoke and copper. His household guard moved through the wreckage calling names, checking wounds, pressing cloth to cuts. On the dais, Walder Frey sat in a chair with Blackfish's hand on his shoulder, like a bolt on a hawk's hood. The screaming had left the old man. What remained was very still and very small. Catelyn stood near the eastern wall, with a strip of cloth held against her right palm. She had raised that hand when a Frey dagger came at her across the table and caught the flat of the blade, mostly. The cut was not deep. She held the cloth without looking at it. She was watching Robb move through the hall. He crossed to her. He took her right hand in both of his and looked at the wound. Not serious. He did not say anything, and she did not say anything, and there was nothing to say that was not already held in the space between them. The letter she had not needed to find. The sealed thing she had broken open on a cold road outside Seaguard. The decision she had brought to him in the gray hours before the worst feast in the history of the Riverlands. The letter that had saved every life in this room. He held her hand for a moment. Then he let it go. Roose Bolton lay near the dais, pinned under Second Wind Stark men, bleeding slowly from the knee. His eyes were open. They were gray and flat and very calm, the eyes of a man running numbers, alive, still counting. He looked up at Robb without fear or appeal, just calculation. Robb crouched beside him. Level, you have questions about what happens next, Robb said. So do I. Bolton said nothing. But behind his eyes, something shifted. On the road south of the twins, a girl stood in the back of a wooden cart with her hands on the rail and her eyes on the gatehouse lights. She had been close enough for an hour to hear the sounds coming from inside the walls. She had been building a certainty around those sounds the way she had learned to build certainties, quietly, with both hands held tight against everything that wanted to take them away. She had been certain she knew what she would find. The sounds had stopped. She listened. The night came back to the twins the way it always came back to loud places, slowly, in pieces, like water finding a level. Then, from somewhere inside the outer walls, a dire wolf howled. Not pain, not warning, something older than both. The sound of something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time and was no longer waiting. Arya Stark stood on the road outside the twins and listened to Grey Wind's voice carry out across the riverlands, and her hands on the rail did not move. She didn't know yet. She would know soon. Dawn found the twins quieter than it had any right to be. The fires in the courtyard had burned to orange coals. Across the outer yard, 40-some bodies of Frey men lay under canvas, the ones who had chosen to fight after the hall fell, and paid for the choice. Fewer than Robb had feared when he laid the plan. More than he wished when he looked at them. He did not look long. The Frey soldiers from the outer camps had come in through the night in ragged groups, not through honor, through arithmetic. Their lords were taken. Their lords' sons were taken. The walls held. Their own fires were cold and their captains were dead or kneeling, and there was a dire wolf somewhere in the dark that had stopped howling but had not been kennelled. By dawn the arithmetic had done its work on most of them. Catelyn stood at the edge of the great hall and watched her son sit in Walder Frey's chair. Robb had not slept. He did not look as though sleep had been offered. He sat in the high seat at the head of the empty table with the same precise straightness he had carried through the whole of the feast, and he was reading, not the letter, which he had read 7 times by now, but the list his captains had brought him. Names, numbers, what had been taken, what had been lost, what was owed. The twins' maester stood near the window with ink on his hands, copying. Each copy of the letter would go out by raven before the sun climbed another hand's width. North to the surviving Stark bannermen, east to the Vale, south to the Stormlands. Every lord in Westeros who still had eyes to read would know, before the week was out, what Tywin Lannister's own hand had written to a man he expected to commit murder and disappear behind a wedding feast. Robb looked up from his list and caught Catelyn watching him. "We hold the trial at the mid-morning bell," he said. "In the hall." She nodded. "In the hall. Where they planned it." Yes, he looked back at the list. Walder Frey was not a man who wept. Catelyn had learned this in the 3 hours she spent watching him held in an antechamber while his hall was swept and his sons were counted. He did not weep, and he did not pray, and he did not shrink. He sat with his infirm body folded in a chair, and he complained about the hardness of the seat, about the cold draught, about the indignity of chains on a lord of his standing. Even now, even with Blackfish standing 4 feet away sharpening his knife without any particular urgency. The old man was dragged into the hall when the bell rang. He stood before Robb's seat, Walder's own seat, in Walder's own hall at Walder's own table, and he tilted his chin up at a 17-year-old king and started talking before Robb opened his mouth. He had rights, Walder said. The oath had been broken first. Robb Stark swore to take a Frey bride and discarded that oath for some foreign woman. And every indignity that followed was the young wolf's own doing. You come into a man's house and break your word at his table, what did he expect would follow? House Frey had dignity. House Frey had Lord Frey. Robb said it the way you press a thumb into a wound. The old man stopped. You had a right to your grievance. Robb's voice was even. No heat, no shake. He looked at Walder the way he looked at maps, with full attention and without feeling. You had every right to refuse me your daughter, to withdraw your forces, to swear no further oaths to the king in the north. You could have stood up from this table and told me to leave your hall and never return. Guest right cuts both ways. A guest owes the host peace. You are correct about that. The hall was very still. What guest right does not protect, Robb continued, is a host who had already written to Tywin Lannister before the first cup was poured. You did not have a grievance, you had a contract. You planned murder under your own roof before your own bread reached the table. The sacred law belongs to the man who honors it. He let that sit for a moment. You broke it first, my lord. Not I. Walder's mouth opened. Blackfish put one hand on his shoulder, and the old man's mouth closed. Lothar Frey was brought forward first. He had his father's eyes, small, wet, always counting, and he used them right up to the last breath, calculating whether some play remained. There was none. Blackfish's sword was quick and clean, and the haul did not linger. Black Walder Rivers came second. He had been a capable man, and he went like one. Straight-backed, silent, the composure of someone who understood that protest would cost him the only thing he had left to keep. He had rolled the dice. He knew it. The hall gave him the silence he did not ask for. The rushes at the foot of the dais were dark. Walder Frey looked at the space where his sons had been and said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone thin, stripped of the complaining quality, just bitter at the bottom. Do you think killing me matters? I have 100 sons, 100 grandsons. Robb looked at him across the length of the table. And they will remember this day, Robb said, every time they consider betraying their king. The execution was clean. The commotion at the gates came before the afternoon bell. Catelyn heard it from the corridor, voices pitched high, the kind of argument where one side is angry and the other is simply not moving. She went toward it the way she had learned, across 3 years of war, to move toward sounds that should not be happening. The gate guard had stopped 2 figures on the road outside. A girl, and a very large man in a helm that looked as though it had been through a fire and come out worse. The large man was not fighting. He was not threatening. He was standing in the gateway with both hands visible, his weight settled, with the quality of something that had decided where it was going to stand and intended to keep standing there until the world arranged itself around that fact. A Stark Guard captain was explaining, with diminishing patience, that the camp was secured and the gates were closed to travelers, and if they would simply tell Lady Stark, the man in the burned helm said, that her daughter is here. Catelyn walked through the gate. The girl stood 3 feet back from the argument, watching it the way she watched everything, from a slight distance, at an angle. Her eyes moving across all of it and returning nothing. She was small. She was dirty in the way that came from roads, not laziness, the grime of weeks, not days. Her clothes had been practical once and were now simply worn. Her hair was dark. Her face was Stark-shaped, angular and sharp, and she was 11 years old, and she had the eyes of someone considerably older. When she saw Catelyn, something in her face shifted, not softening, something closer to recognition, the particular steadying that happens when a person who has been navigating a long time without landmarks finds one. Catelyn did not speak. There was nothing she could have made her throat produce that would have been sufficient, and she had never been a woman who reached for insufficient. She crossed the space between them and took her daughter in both arms. Arya had been through too much to cry the way girls were supposed to cry. She made no sound. She pressed her face against her mother's shoulder, and her arms came up and wrapped around Catelyn's back with the grip of someone who had spent a very long time deciding they did not need this, and had, in this exact moment, run out of the will it required to go on deciding that. Catelyn held her. She did not speak. She pressed her cheek to the top of Arya's head and kept her eyes open and breathed. Robb came through the gate a few minutes later. He had been told. He came quickly and then stopped when he saw them, a few feet out, and he looked at his sister with the full attention of a man taking in a report he was not entirely prepared for. The small, road-worn, too quiet girl who had left Winterfell wanting to learn swords, and had come back as something she would need to explain slowly, over time, when they could finally sit still long enough. He did not ask her anything. Not yet. He put his arms around both of them. The 3 of them stood in the gateway of the twins in the gray afternoon, and no words came, because none were needed, and none were equal to the task. The man in the burned helm watched this from a few feet away. Then, he turned and leaned against the gatehouse wall and looked out at the road south. He had not been thanked. He did not appear to be waiting for it. An hour later, Robb stood at the battlements above the main gate. The riverlands stretched before him in the late light, brown fields, gray rivers, the distant thread of the King's Road winding south toward everything still unfinished. He had a fortified crossing, a letter in Tywin Lannister's own hand distributed across 3 regions of the realm. 6,000 men where he had arrived with fewer than 5,000. His mother was alive. His sister was in the courtyard below, talking to Daisy Mormont in a low voice and watching Grey Wind pace the inner yard with that measured, unhurried movement the wolf had whenever the immediate danger had passed but the world had not yet settled. Catelyn came up behind him. He did not turn. "Send a raven to Jon." A pause. "He's at the wall. I know where he is." The river moved below them in the last of the light. "Send it anyway." The week after the purge of the twins ran to a rhythm Robb set deliberately. Ravens at dawn, councils at midday, patrols at dusk, and in the hours between those fixed points, the work of turning a battle into something that lasted longer than a battle. The night before the trial, Robb sat with Bolton in the antechamber for 3 hours. A maester was present with parchment. Bolton spoke, not out of loyalty, not out of fear, but out of the cold pragmatism of a man who understood that the information he carried was the only currency remaining to him. He gave Robb the Lannister troop dispositions south of the Riverlands. He gave him the locations of Bolton-loyal holdouts across the north. He gave him the precise conditions in which Ramsay Snow was holding Theon Greyjoy at the Dreadfort. He provided all of it precisely, and without embellishment, like a man paying a debt he had decided to settle before the settlement was taken from him by force. By morning, Robb had what he needed. Roose Bolton's trial was held that morning. It lasted less than an hour. The evidence was the letter, the mail shirt, and the testimony of 8 men who had watched Bolton wound second Stark soldiers with cold precision before the Warhammer took him down. The sentence was carried out that afternoon in the courtyard, in the northern manor, Robb presiding. He did it himself, as his father had always done. The man who passes the sentence swings the blade. The courtyard was very quiet afterward. Grey Wind sat at the far wall and did not move. The head was prepared and packed the following morning, with a letter in Robb's hand addressed to the Dreadfort. Not a demand. An offer. Open the gates. Deliver Ramsay Snow, Roose Bolton's bastard, the man who held Theon Greyjoy somewhere in those cold towers, and the men of the Dreadfort could keep their lands and their lives under new terms. Refuse, and Robb would come north with an army and take the Dreadfort the hard way, and there would be no further offers after that. The raven carrying the letter flew northeast into a gray sky. The Frey question took longer. Walder's line was broad and tangled, dozens of children, grandchildren, bastards, half-acknowledged cousins, most of them with no knowledge of the conspiracy and no particular loyalty to the men who had planned it. Robb named a council of 4 of the most senior uninvolved Freys to administer the twins under Stark oversight and appointed a northern castellan to hold the crossing. The Green Fork was too strategically vital to leave ungoverned. The Frey name was too damaged to rule it unsupervised. Neither his Frey council nor his northern lords were entirely satisfied with this arrangement. Robb took that as a reasonable sign it was probably correct. Edmure Tully was freed on the 3rd day. His marriage to Rosalind Frey required more careful handling. Rosalind herself, young, quiet, visibly shaken since the moment she had understood what her father's wedding had actually been, had spent the week in a tower room asking nothing of anyone. Robb sent for her. He told her plainly her marriage was valid, her lands were her own, and she would be judged on her own conduct and nothing else. She was not her father. He would not treat her as though she were. She said nothing. She gave one precise nod. He had the impression she had been waiting for something simple and true for a long time and had stopped believing it would arrive. On the 5th day, Robb summoned the lords. The hall had been cleaned. Fresh rushes on the floor, the Stark direwolf at one end and the Tully trout at the other, and the men filling the benches were a different assembly than the one that had celebrated a Frey wedding 5 days before. Northern lords, river lords, who had ridden hard when the ravens reached them. The Greyat, who had been given no chair and had collected one from a side table without asking. Maeg Mormont, Galbart Glover, Edmure Tully holding his cup with the steadiness of a man who had been through a great deal and was not quite done with it. Robb did not give them a prepared speech. He stood at the head of the table and spoke the way he spoke before a charge plainly, and with his full attention on the people in front of him. The North was not declaring war on the South, he said. The North had been at war since the day Joffrey Baratheon had Ned Stark's head taken off on the steps of the Great Sept. What was changing was not the state of war. What was changing was the understanding of who had started it, and why, and whose gold had paid for every body on every battlefield from the Whispering Wood to the Green Fork. The men who had betrayed the Northern cause from within, Bolton, Frey, and Stark before them, had been answered for. The North did not forget. The North did not bargain that away. The North remembered. He did not want the Iron Throne, he said. He was prepared to say that in front of every lord in the Seven Kingdoms, and mean it every time. The Iron Throne was a chair built from the weapons of conquered enemies, and it had been producing ruin since the day the first man sat on it. He was the king in the North. That was sufficient. That was everything. And then Tywin Lannister had put his name on a letter instructing a man to murder his king at a wedding feast. He had done it with the confidence of a man who believed the letter would never be seen. It had been seen. He let the room sit with that for a moment. What does a man owe a king who orders his murder? The hall answered. Not in words, in sound, in the force of men who had been cold and hungry and losing for nearly 2 years, and had just been handed the one thing that changed the equation. It filled the hall from the rushes to the rafters, and ran out through the arrow slits and across the river. Robb raised one hand. The sound stopped. Then we go and collect it, he said. The ravens went out that same afternoon. Robb watched each one from the rookery window, dark shapes lifting into a gray sky, carrying different messages to different hands for different purposes. To the Vale, a single paragraph in Catelyn's hand, addressed to Lysa Arryn at the Eyrie. Catelyn knew her sister's pride and how to navigate around it. The message was notification, not request. The conspiracy that killed Ned Stark had been exposed and answered for. The North had survived. House Tully had survived with it. The king in the North expected nothing of the Vale and would take careful note of who chose to stand apart in a moment like this. To Dragonstone, Robb's own draft, written 3 times before he was satisfied. Addressed to Lord Stannis Baratheon, not your grace, not king, not pretender. Lord. A word chosen with the precision of a blade placed between 2 ribs. What followed was equally precise. House Stark and House Baratheon shared enemies who had tried to remove them both by force and by treachery. There was no profit in fighting each other while those enemies rebuilt. Robb was not proposing an alliance. He was proposing a channel. 2 men could stay out of each other's way without calling it friendship. We share enemies, the letter ended. We need not share them on 2 fronts. The letter to Highgarden was the one Robb had discussed with no one but Catelyn before he wrote it. He had thought carefully about what Tywin Lannister was doing at this exact moment. Assembling a picture of the twins' failure from fragmentary reports and escaped riders, beginning to calculate what came next. Tywin's eyes were everywhere. His ravens intercepted other ravens when it suited him. Robb assumed the Highgarden message would not arrive privately, so he wrote something false. Not carelessly false, carefully false. In the way that required understanding what an enemy expected to find. He wrote that the king in the North was consolidating his position at the Twins, and intended to fortify through the winter before pressing south. He wrote that he was opening diplomatic contact with the Golden Company in Essos, and awaiting their response before committing to further military movement. He was not consolidating at the Twins. He was already thinking about what lay southwest, past the Golden Tooth, past the stronghold that every man in Westeros assumed no enemy would ever bother marching toward. He sealed the letter and sent it. On the 6th morning, the cavalry column rode south. 300 northern horse, fast riders, light kit. Men who knew how to move across ground without advertising the movement. Their stated orders were to scout Lannister troop positions on the King's Road south of the Trident. Their actual orders carried a secondary task: find the road between Harrenhal and the Crown Lands, and find out whether a one-handed man and a woman in blue armor were still on it. Robb watched them ride out from the gatehouse. Grey Wind stood at his heel, still, Simultaneously, the Blackfish broke camp on the North Road. 2,000 men, Tully cavalry, Northern light horse, the fastest element Robb had, pulling away from the twins at the pace of riders and not wagons. They would reach the edge of the neck in 10 days. Moat Catelyn in 12. "You know what's in those towers," Catelyn said, beside him. "Dying Ironborn," Robb said. "And after?" He looked north. The King's Road ran into a horizon that was, somewhere behind it, across the neck and the Blackwater and the old stones, Winterfell. "Home," he said. The word came out plainly, without ceremony. "After them, we go home." Behind him, in the yard near the stables, Arya was watching the cavalry column disappear down the south road. She had stood there for most of the morning with her arms crossed and her eyes on the riders, giving nothing away. Then she turned back toward the hall and caught Robb's eye on her way through the door. She stopped. "Sansa," she said. "Just the name. The way you say a fact you've been holding for a long time. She doesn't know we're alive." She went inside. Robb stood at the gatehouse a moment longer. "Send a raven to King's Landing," he said quietly, "to anyone inside those walls who can get it to her." Grey Wind leaned against his leg. Still, the ground changed before the castle came into view. Sir Brynden Tully had been riding for 12 days, and he knew the neck the way a man knew a scar. Not fondly, but completely. The King's Road narrowed here, pressed in by the encroaching swamp until it was barely wide enough for 3 horses abreast. The air thickened with it, wet rot and black water, and the particular green-gray smell that the neck breathed out year-round, regardless of season. The mist came up to the horses' chests on the low ground, and never fully burned off, even at midday. Men who didn't know the neck made the mistake of thinking it was fog. It was not fog. It was a weapon, patient and indifferent, that turned confident columns into lines of riders who couldn't see the man 10 yards ahead, and began to hear things in the reeds they couldn't explain afterward. The crannogmen appeared first, as they always did. 2 of them, in a flat-bottomed boat that materialized out of the reed beds at the road's edge, as though it had been there all along, and the mist had simply chosen to stop hiding it. Small men in leather and mud-gray, faces painted the color of winter silt. They looked at the vanguard in silence. Brynden looked back. After a moment, one of them raised a hand. Not a greeting, a count. Then the boat slid back into the mist and was gone. "Lord Reed's people," his second said. "They've been watching the towers for months," Brynden said. "Ask them what they saw." What the crannogmen reported, through the oblique and precise language they used for military intelligence, was this: the Ironborn garrison had arrived with approximately 250 men. Fever had taken the first ones in the 3rd week. It spread slowly through the towers across the months following, the way disease spread in still water, not fast, but without stopping. By the crannogmen's count, fewer than 80 men were still on their feet. The rest were in the towers, horizontal, waiting for something to resolve them, one way or the other. Resupply had come once, 2 months ago, 4 boats up the Saltspear. Nothing since. The boats had brought grain and men. The grain was gone. Some of the men were dead. Brynden listened to this and asked one question. Are they burning their dead, or leaving them? The crannogman considered. "Leaving," he said. Brynden nodded. Leaving meant they had stopped planning for the future. Moat Catelyn rose out of the mist an hour later. 3 towers, partially ruined, built from a black stone that did not exist anywhere else in the neck and had never been quarried from any site a maester could locate. The gatehouse tower, solid and functional. The drunkard's tower, leaning at that distinctive angle on foundations that had been threatening to fail for several centuries without ever quite failing. The children's tower, which the oldest stories said had been built before the first men came to Westeros, and which looked exactly old enough for the stories to be true. Ironborn banners hung from 2 of the 3 towers. The Kraken of House Greyjoy, black on gray, but the gray was faded, the fabric fraying at the edges, the banners dressed unevenly and not adjusted since they went up. No one had tended them. Brynden counted the shapes on the walls. He counted again. He gave the number some thought. He turned to his second. "Count the heads on the battlements." The man counted. He gave a number. Brynden looked at the towers, at the banners, at the particular quality of stillness that had settled over Moat Cailin, not the stillness of men at rest, but the stillness of men for whom motion had become expensive. "They're already dead," Brynden said. "They just haven't stopped moving yet." He sent a herald forward with terms. The Ironborn response came quickly. An arrow, fired from the gatehouse tower, that landed in the causeway stone 6 feet to the herald's left. Not a near miss. A statement. The herald rode back. Brynden watched the towers. He sent the herald back with a second message. He dictated it carefully, choosing the words with the deliberateness of a man who wanted no ambiguity between the message he intended and the message received. "The man who sent you here, Theon Greyjoy, who took this castle in a raid while the king in the north was away, is a prisoner at the Dreadfort. Your lord, Balon Greyjoy, is on the Iron Islands and is not coming. You are 80 men in a swamp, and you have been here for months, and the neck is not finished with you. We will not breach these walls today. We will not breach them tomorrow. We will simply wait, and every day we wait, the neck collects a little more of what you owe it." The arrow that came back in response to the second message landed 4 feet to the herald's left. The range was improving. Brynden took that as the last expression of pride the garrison had left, and respected it accordingly. He made camp on the causeway, and waited. 3 days. On the first day, 11 men were visible on the walls at the morning count. By the afternoon count, 9. Brynden did not record this as victory. He recorded it as mathematics. On the second day, the cook fires inside the gatehouse tower went cold before dawn and were not relit. This was the detail that told him the most. A garrison with any real capacity to continue resisted the temptation to conserve fuel. They kept fires because fire meant warmth, and warmth meant fighting strength. A garrison that let its fires go cold had stopped thinking in those terms. On the third night, the Crannogmen brought a report. A single Ironborn man had gone into the bog on the eastern side of the causeway at midnight. Whether attempting escape or driven half-mad by fever, they couldn't say. He had made it 40 yards into the reeds before the bog took him. They had not interfered. The neck had its own justice, and they had learned long ago not to interrupt it. Brynden sat with this information for a while. Then he went to sleep. He was awoken before the 4th dawn by the sound he had been waiting for. Not fighting. Not arrows, just a mechanism, the grinding, long-disused groan of a gate bar being drawn back. The Ironborn captain walked out of the gatehouse tower alone, in the dark, with his sword reversed in his hand and held out from his body at arm's length. He was younger than Brynden had expected, perhaps 25, broad-shouldered in the Ironborn way, but diminished. The way a man was diminished by months of fever and damp and watching his people die in a swamp for a lord who never came. He had the dignity not to fall, which cost him something visible. He stood on the causeway in front of Brynden's torch and looked at the sword in his own hand for a moment, as though confirming this was still what he wanted to do. Then he looked up. "We want to go home," he said. No negotiation, no terms, no conditions, no counteroffer, just that. The most basic thing a man could ask for. Brynden looked at him. He looked at the gate behind him, and at the shapes barely visible through it, men who had crawled out of their sickbeds to stand and watch this, most of them upright only through the particular stubbornness of people who refused to be carried. He looked at the black water on either side of the causeway, and at the mist sitting above it, and at the towers built from stone no one could explain. "Give me your sword," Brynden said. "All of them. Swords, axes, everything that cuts. Pile it on the causeway." The Ironborn captain handed over his sword without argument. "Then you go to Seaguard. There will be ships. You sail home. You tell Balon Greyjoy that Moat Cailin belongs to the king in the north, and that the king in the north let you go because you were soldiers following orders. Not because he couldn't stop you." The captain said nothing. "Your men who are too sick to walk," Brynden said, "stay until they can. We'll feed them. When they're fit to travel, they leave." "Why?" "Because I gave my word to my king." Brynden's voice was entirely flat, and unlike the last lord who used this gate for treachery, I keep mine. The weapons came out over the next hour. The pile on the causeway grew. By the time the sun was fully up, the gateway to the north was open. Robb arrived with the main column 2 days later. He rode through the gates of Moat Cailin at midday, the columns strung out behind him along the causeway, and back into the mist, Grey Wind moving at his horse's flank, with that particular steady pace the wolf had adopted, when everything immediate had been resolved, and the remaining danger was still too far away to run at. Robb did not make a speech. He rode through the gate and dismounted and climbed the gatehouse tower alone, leaving his captains in the yard. From the top of the tower he could see north. Not far, the mist in the next Blackwater and the reed beds cut the horizon down to a few miles. But north was north. The same direction as Winterfell. The same direction as the bones of his father's hall. Stripped by Boltons and burned by Ironborn, still standing in whatever way ruins stood, waiting, he stood there for a while. Grey Wind had climbed behind him and now sat at his leg, looking north with the same unreadable attention the wolf gave to everything. Below in the yard, Brynden was already issuing orders, the occupation of the towers, the road assessment, the logistics of moving an army of thousands through a causeway built for hundreds. Robb could hear the particular tone of a man who had no interest in symbolic moments, and a great deal of interest in whether the Drunkard's Tower's foundations would hold the weight of a garrison. Robb looked north a moment longer. Then he called for a maester and dictated a single raven. It was addressed to Winterfell, still occupied, still held by Bolton loyalists, who didn't yet know their lord's head had traveled north without the rest of him. There was no one there who would welcome the message. It didn't matter. The message read, "We are coming home." He sent it into the gray sky and watched it go. Riverrun had been under siege for months. The Lannister force camped south of the walls had received word of the twins, the way bad news always traveled. In pieces, each piece worse than the last, carried by riders who had been riding too hard for too long, and arrived with the particular look of men delivering information they wished they were wrong about. The calculation that followed had not taken long. They struck their camp in the night and marched south before dawn. They left behind siege engines half assembled, supply carts stripped and abandoned, fire rings gone cold in the damp earth. The ruts their wagons pressed into the ground were still soft when Edmure Tully rode across his own drawbridge for the first time in 5 months. He did not say anything when he entered the yard. He dismounted, and he stood in the courtyard of his father's house, and he looked at the red stone walls and the towers and the water of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone visible through the arrow slits, and then he went inside. His father was already in the ground. Lord Hoster Tully had died while his son was bait in a fray trap, and Edmure had not been there for it. He carried that in the lines of his face and did not speak of it, which was exactly what a man in his position was expected to do, and exactly how much it cost him. Robb arrived 3 days later with the main column and the decision he had been forming since Moat Cailin. The ceremony would be at Riverrun. Not in the north, not at the Twins. Not at some neutral meeting ground chosen for political convenience. At the confluence of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone, in the great hall of the Tully seat, where the red stone walls had stood for centuries before the Targaryens came, and centuries before the Andals, and would stand for centuries after all of them were ash and legend. The Riverlands had bled in this war alongside the North. They had given men and fields and castles and lords' sons. They would be recognized not as allies, not as bannermen, but as part of what Robb was. The crown had been made by the Riverrun smiths in the 2 days before the ceremony. It was not elegant. It had been assembled from a northern lord's bronze collar piece, dark metal, heavy, and a Tully household brooch of river-green bronze. The family's particular alloy, and the 2 bronzes had been welded together by the castle smith in a join that was visible if you looked, a seam running through the crown where 2 different metals had been pressed together under heat and hammer until they held. It was not a pretty join. It was a permanent one. Robb felt the weight of it the moment the High Septon's representative placed it on his head. Not spiritual weight, physical weight. Bronze was heavier than it looked, and this was 2 crowns worth of bronze pressed into one. The great hall held perhaps 200 people. More would have come if there had been more time. What was here was sufficient, the Greatjon on the left side of the hall. Standing rather than sitting, because the Greatjon sat when he chose to, and this was not one of those occasions. Maeg Mormont of Bear Island, gray-haired and composed. Galbart Glover, the Manderley representative from White Harbor, a broad-faced man in the northern style, who had ridden 500 miles in 14 days when the Raven reached him. Edmure Tully at the front, his face composed in the particular way of a man holding several difficult things at once, minor lords from a dozen riverlords' houses, and at the back, quiet and watchful, representatives of 3 minor Frey branches who had survived the purge because they had not been part of it and had bent the knee since. Their presence was deliberate. Robb had insisted on it. Whatever the Frey name meant now, it would mean something different going forward, and the difference started with who was in the room. Catelyn sat at Robb's right when he took the ceremonial chair. Not behind him, not to the side. Right, Talisa sat beyond her. She was visibly pregnant now, 7 months, the weight of it changing how she held herself. The particular upright care of a woman carrying something she had decided she would carry well. When the lords knelt, she did not kneel. She sat with both hands folded in her lap and watched her husband receive his second crown, and her expression was not soft. It was something harder and more private than softness, the face of a woman calculating what the world her child would enter was going to cost. Grey wind lay at the foot of the chair. Still, the north and the trident, Robb said, when the kneeling was done and the room was on its feet. Not one and the other. Both. That is what we are from today. The great Jon was the first to shout. He was always the first to shout. The real work began the morning after. A raven had arrived from King's Landing the previous evening, during the coronation feast. It bore a Dornish seal, a sun and spear pressed in orange wax. No name on the outside. The message was not an offer of alliance. It was an acknowledgement, written in an educated hand that gave nothing away. The lion bleeds. Dorne watches. Robb read it twice and handed it to Catelyn without comment. She read it and handed it back. That's the closest to an invitation we're going to get. I know. He folded the letter carefully. Find out whose hand that is. I want to know whether this comes from Oberyn Martell directly or from someone writing on his behalf. The Treasury report came next, delivered by Sir Perwyn, one of the surviving Freys who had proved useful in the administrative chaos of the past weeks, in the particular tone of a man conveying numbers he still didn't entirely believe. The assessment of the captured Frey and Bolton gold, inventoried across 3 days at the Twins, and cross-referenced with the Dreadfort's surrender accounts, between 280,000 and 350,000 gold dragons in coin, plate, and holdings. More than the North had seen in a generation, more than the war had cost, though only barely. Robb listened to the number. He did not celebrate it. He said, "How much of it do we need to sustain the march south and pay every man in this army through the winter?" Sir Perwyn gave a number. Robb looked at what was left over. He said, "Send for Maester Vyman. I need to write a letter to Braavos." The Golden Company had been discussed once before, briefly, in the councils at the Twins, raised by Lord Glover's steward as a theoretical option and set aside, because the cost was theoretical and the war was real. It was not theoretical now. The envoy to Braavos was a single trusted man, a Tully household knight named Sir Lucas, who had traveled to Essos before and spoke enough Valyrian to negotiate without revealing everything in his voice. His instructions were to make contact, establish whether the company's current contract could be revisited, and return with a number. Robb told no one else. Not Catelyn, not the Blackfish, not Edmure. He asked himself, what would 10,000 men buy us that we cannot buy ourselves? His answer? Unspoken certainty. Every military calculation he had made about King's Landing relied on things going correctly, on Stannis' fleet performing, on the Tyrell alliance fracturing, on the city's garrison not being reinforced before he reached the walls. The Golden Company bought the margin. It was the difference between a plan that worked if 3 things went right and a plan that worked regardless. Whether the company would come at all depended on their current contract, their price, and whether the man Robb sent could negotiate without showing his hand. Those variables were out of his control now. He sent the letter and stopped thinking about it. The cavalry scouts rode in from the south on the 4th day after the coronation. They had been gone 3 weeks. They came back lean and fast, in the way of men who had been moving hard and eating light, and had not stopped moving until the castle gates. Their report was delivered in Robb's war room, standing over the painted table, maps spread under candlelight. Tywin had positioned a combined force south of the Trident. The exact location, a river crossing on the King's Road roughly 80 miles north of the capital, where the road narrowed between the river and a ridge of high ground that gave defensive advantage to whoever held it first. Lannister heavy infantry anchoring the center, Tyrell cavalry on the wings. The combined estimate, 40,000 men, possibly closer to 45,000. The good ground between the Trident and King's Landing had been taken before Robb's army left the Riverlands. His captains looked at the map. Several of them looked at Robb. He was smiling. It was the particular smile he had worn at the Whispering Wood, when the Lannister cavalry had charged exactly where he needed it to charge. The smile that among his captains had come to mean, he already knows what he is going to do, and he has been waiting for the enemy to finish making his mistake. "They came to us," Robb said. "Good." The Great Jon looked at the map, and then at Robb, and then back at the map. "You're going to explain that," he said. "Tomorrow," Robb said. "Tonight we eat. Tomorrow I'll tell you where the Ruby Ford is and why Tywin Lannister just handed us the battle we needed." He rolled the map. Grey Wind stood from the corner of the room, stretched, and walked to Robb's side. Still, the Raven arrived at the 7th hour on a gray morning, which was notable only because it arrived 9 days after the purge of the twins, rather than 5. A message of that magnitude, the failure of the entire northern strategy, the deaths of his principal Riverlands asset, and the man he had spent a decade positioning in the north, should have reached King's Landing in 5 days at most. The 4-day gap meant the twins' rookery had been seized immediately, which meant Robb Stark had controlled the flow of information from the first hour, which meant the boy was operating at a level of strategic precision that Tywin had not fully accounted for. Tywin absorbed this implication before he finished the first paragraph. He read the letter twice. His counselors Varys, Pycelle, Cersei, Tyrion, and Lord Mace Tyrell, who had been summoned that morning for reasons not yet explained to him, watched him the way men watched a mountain for the first movement of snow. Nothing changed in Tywin's face. The candles on the table appeared to burn at the same angle as before the letter arrived. His hands, holding the parchment flat, were entirely still. He set the letter down. "Send additional riders to the blocking position south of the Trident," he said. "The men already there need updated orders." He rose. "I need an hour." The room cleared without argument. Alone in the council chamber, Tywin permitted himself 1 minute to understand what had gone wrong. He had constructed the Red Wedding over months, not in anger, with the patient, meticulous calculation that had always been his most reliable instrument, the kind of patience that separated him from every other man who had tried to hold power in Westeros and had failed because they moved too quickly, loved too personally, or let their pride outrun their intelligence. He had read the Stark campaign correctly. He had read Walder Frey's grievances correctly, the precise weight of that old man's wounded pride, the price it would take to transform resentment into action, the exact terms under which Frey would stop being a political inconvenience and become a weapon. He had read Roose Bolton's character with equal clarity, the quality of his loyalty, the ceiling of his price, the discipline of his ambition. He had threaded every needle. He had not read Catelyn Stark. He had placed her in his calculations as a grieving woman, a political wife operating at the edge of her competence, making decisions from emotion rather than strategy, releasing Jaime Lannister without her son's approval, that unilateral act of maternal catastrophe that had cost the Starks 2 of their best cavalry captains for nothing in return. That was the woman he had assessed. A woman who led with love and paid for it, and had not yet learned to stop. He had not considered that grief, properly directed, became something else. That a woman who had watched her family be dismantled piece by piece for 2 years might stop leading with her heart and start watching for knives instead. A sealed letter, a traveling courier taken on the road, a mother who understood, finally and too late for him, what the world actually required of her. He had been undone by a woman reading his mail. Tywin stood at the window for the remaining 51 seconds. Then he returned to his desk. The small council meeting that afternoon was the worst hour of Tyrion Lannister's political career, which was saying something. Joffrey had been informed between the morning's first and second meetings. The evidence of this was visible when Tyrion arrived, a broken inkwell on the throne room floor, 2 overturned chairs, and a purple bruise forming on Sir Merentrant's forearm from where Joffrey had apparently swung a decorative sword, before Cersei managed to intervene. By the time the council convened, the king had progressed from actively breaking things to sitting in his chair and vibrating with the specific outrage of someone who had issued commands and found the world declining to obey them. "I want his head," Joffrey said. He had been saying this, in various forms, for the better part of an hour. "Robb Stark's head. Someone bring it to me." That is a royal command. Tywin was reviewing a map. He did not look up. Cersei tried. "The situation calls for a measured, I don't want measured." Joffrey's voice had the register of an adolescent who had encountered, for the first time, an obstacle that his title did not dissolve. "He slaughtered our allies. He sits in Riverrun, calling himself a king, and you say measured, he sits in Riverrun." Tywin said, without looking up, "Because we permitted him to by failing to ensure the twins held." Joffrey's mouth closed. Across the table, Tyrion caught his father's eye for one moment. Not warmth. They had never managed warmth, and were not going to start over a war council table. But understanding. The shared recognition of two men who could see the same burning house and disagreed only about whether to run from it or negotiate with the fire. Tyrion looked away first. He always looked away first. Joffrey, having been redirected by Tywin's quiet demolition into shame, which was at least silent, subsided into his chair. The meeting that followed was functional, if grim. Tyrell troop movements, supply assessments, the reinforcement of the blocking position anchored on the river crossing south of the Trident. Tywin's voice, when he spoke, was the voice of a man who had not revised his fundamental assessment of the situation, but had updated the variables. He had been outmaneuvered at the Twins. He had not been defeated. Those were different things, and he intended to ensure everyone in the room understood the difference. Tyrion waited until the tactical discussion reached its natural pause. "There is another option," he said. He used the careful tone he reserved for things he already knew would be rejected, but felt obligated to say regardless, the tone that had been getting him into trouble his entire adult life. "An envoy. Quiet, informal, routed through a neutral house. We acknowledge the North as a sovereign territory and the Riverlands as Stark jurisdiction. We end the war on terms that preserve the Westerlands and the capital." The table looked at him. Varys arranged his expression into something that was not quite a smile, and not quite its absence. Pycelle made the sound he made when he was deciding which way the room was going. Cersei's face ran through the arithmetic of whether this was disloyalty or pragmatism before settling into something harder. Tywin set down his quill. "No," he said. "The military calculation. No, if the blocking force fails to hold the crossing, we negotiate from inside the city walls. That is a significantly weaker. I am fully aware of what that position entails." Tywin's voice had the quality of a gate being latched. "What you are proposing is the Lord of Casterly Rock acknowledging that a Stark boy with an intercepted letter and a dead traitor's army has beaten him. I will not do that." "It is not acknowledgement of defeat," Tyrion said. "It is the prevention of a worse defeat. It is defeat with better grammar." Silence settled over the table. Tyrion looked at his wine cup. He did not drink from it. Joffrey was watching Tywin with the expression of a young man who had spent his life being afraid of very few people, and had just been reminded of which people those were. "And if the blocking force fails anyway?" Tyrion asked. Quietly, not pressing, just completing the thought, laying it on the table where it would have to be looked at eventually. "Then we hold King's Landing," Tywin said. "The Red Keep has not fallen in 300 years. He picked up his quill and returned to the map. The meeting ran another 40 minutes and resolved nothing Tyrion wanted resolved. Sansa Stark had been told nothing. She had collected what she knew the way she collected everything in the Red Keep, sideways, in pieces, from the spaces between conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Something large had happened in the Riverlands. Something that had caused Lord Tywin to cancel appointments and the castle's maesters to work through the night. Something that had produced a quality in the air of the Red Keep over the past 10 days that she could feel but could not name, a tightening, like rope under tension. She did not dare ask what it was. She had learned, across months in King's Landing, that asking questions attracted attention, and attention in the Red Keep had a way of becoming danger before it became information. That afternoon, at a minor court gathering in the Queen's Solar, the kind of event Cersei organized to maintain the appearance that life in the capital was proceeding normally, Sansa sat in her place and performed the version of herself that survival required. Attentive, compliant, careful, she had become accomplished at performing it. The performance had a cost she was learning not to count. Cersei was at the far end of the room, managing the function with the automatic grace of a woman who had been performing her own version of the same act for longer than Sansa had been alive. She was watching the room. Her eyes moved across it with the patient sweep of someone cataloging variables. They landed on Sansa. Cersei looked at the girl for a moment. The auburn hair, the careful posture, the gray eyes that had learned to give nothing away in a face still young enough that the effort showed. She held the look one beat longer than a casual glance. She was thinking something she had not permitted herself to think clearly since the ravens began arriving. Something that arrived now, quiet and uninvited, with the particular weight of truths that had been waiting to be acknowledged. She has her brother's eyes. Cersei looked away. Tywin reviewed the map at the third hour after midnight. The candles had burned to stubs. Blackwater Bay was dark beyond the window, the city quieter below than it was during the day. The particular quiet of 100,000 people asleep and unaware that the men above them were managing a war that was no longer going as planned. He had been in worse positions. The Rain Tarbeck Rebellion, when the outcome had not been secure and one wrong decision ended everything. The Mad King's Court, 20 years of navigating madness without becoming its casualty. The sack of King's Landing itself, a calculated risk so precisely timed that even now, people called it opportunism rather than strategy. He had navigated all of it. He was still here. The blocking force south of the Trident was a strong position. Not impregnable, nothing was impregnable when a man with Robb Stark's understanding of terrain was approaching it. But strong. The Tyrell cavalry on the wings was the finest in Westeros. Combined with Lannister heavy infantry on the high ground above the ford, it was designed to make a direct assault catastrophic. Robb Stark did not make direct assaults. Tywin was aware of this. He was counting on the ford's geography to make the indirect approach unavailable. He took 3 scrolls from the desk and sealed each with the Lannister lion, the wax pressed with deliberate evenness. 1 raven to Highgarden, Mace Tyrell's revised positioning orders, a flanking adjustment for the right wing that tightened the river approach. 1 raven to the Citadel, a request framed as historical inquiry, concerning the precedents for siege law and the obligation of neutral parties during contested succession. 1 raven to Essos, a name on the outside, the contents sealed separately and not shared with the maester who carried it to the rookery. The ravens lifted from the tower one by one and vanished into the dark above Blackwater Bay. Tywin watched them go. Then, he blew out the candles and went to bed. He was still here. He intended to remain so. The Ruby Ford did not look like a place where history had ended. It looked like a river crossing in late autumn, brown water moving fast over a flat stone bed, shallow enough to wade at the center, and deep enough at the banks to drown a horse that missed its footing. The reeds on the northern bank were gold going brown. The stones of the ford itself were gray and wet and unremarkable, worn smooth by centuries of travelers who had crossed here, because this was the only viable crossing within 30 miles in either direction. Robert Baratheon had killed Rhaegar Targaryen here 17 years ago. Not elegantly, with a warhammer and brute force, and the particular ferocity of a man fighting for something personal. Rhaegar's breastplate had been set with rubies, the Targaryen fire gems, and Robert's hammer had driven them into the ford when it caved the prince's chest in. The ford had run red with gems and blood together. By the following morning, every ruby had been collected by soldiers who understood the value of what the river carried. The ford returned to being a river crossing. The name stayed. History left its marks whether the places wanted them or not. Robb studied it from the tree line on the eastern ridge in the last gray of pre-dawn. He had been there an hour. Long enough to count the enemy cook fires on the northern bank, long enough to feel the shape of what Tywin had built, long enough to understand that the position was exactly as good as he had known it would be when the scouts first described it. Tywin Lannister did not establish bad positions. The combined Lannister-Tyrell force held the northern bank in force. Lannister heavy infantry anchored to the high ground above the crossing, the ridge that commanded the ford, the ground that made any direct assault require fighting uphill through fast water first. Tyrell cavalry on both wings, the finest mounted soldiers in Westeros, positioned to crush any flanking attempt before it developed. The ford itself was the kill ground. Whoever pushed across it would do so under arrow fire, in water that slowed them, against a prepared position on the far bank. The estimate, 42,000 men. Robb had 18,000. He turned to his captains. "They built a door," he said, "and they're standing in front of it, which means they want me to try the door." The Greatjon looked at the ford and then at Robb. "So, we don't try the door. We take the walls." The plan had been assembled across 2 days in a farmhouse 6 miles east, around a table with a map, revised 3 times as the scout reports came in. Robb had not slept much. He had the look he always carried before a fight, not energized, not frightened, but settled, the way a man looked when he had stopped asking whether and was only asking how. The infantry, 10,000 men, the bulk of the army, would march toward the ford at first light. Visibly, loudly, banners raised, drums going, the full weight of an army committing to a direct assault on a prepared position. The Lannister center would brace. The Tyrell cavalry would tighten on the wings in anticipation of a flanking movement they expected to stop before it reached them, while they were watching the infantry. 3,000 northern cavalry had been moving since midnight, not toward the ford, away from it, east into the tree line, looping north through the forest above the ridge. A detachment of 2,000 had crossed 4 miles upstream in the dark, on foot, through a shallower crossing that the Lannister scouts had assessed and dismissed as impractical. The trap closed from 3 directions simultaneously. Not superior numbers, better geometry. The infantry reached the ford at full light. Drums, banners, the churning sound of 10,000 boots on stone and then on riverbed gravel, the trident rising to their knees as the front ranks pushed into the shallows. The Lannister archers came forward on the far bank, and the arrows came down. They came at the angle the bank allowed. Not ideal, but not nothing. Men fell in the ford. Northern men, river lords, men who had marched 300 miles, and had their last few yards taken from them in brown water, with a Lannister arrow in them. The water slowed the column. The water was supposed to slow them. The Lannister heavy horse committed. They came through the ford at a canter, the thunder of 6,000 horses on stone riverbed, carrying both ways along the bank and through the forest on the ridge above. The sound was the sound of something massive and certain, a force that had done the calculation and liked the numbers. The Stark infantry in the shallows had not broken. But it would. When 6,000 horses hit it from the rear, it would break the way everything broke eventually. The lead riders were 50 yards into the ford when the sound changed. Not from the ford. Not from the Lannister line. From somewhere east. From the forest on the ridge above. From the direction the Tyrell cavalry had been watching with professional calm all morning, waiting for the small flanking move they expected to turn back before it developed into anything. The ground shook differently. The Tyrell cavalry were good soldiers. The best. They registered the change before they heard it clearly, and they were already turning when the northern horse came out of the trees, not at a probe, not at the pace of a detachment feeling its way forward, but at a full gallop. 3,000 men who had been riding through dark forest for 4 hours and came out of the tree line with everything they had accumulated. They turned, and they met them. Wheel, engage, hold. The Tyrells did what trained soldiers did when the unexpected arrived, which was respond to it with the skills they had. Steel on steel along the eastern wing, horses screaming, the Tyrell line pushing back against the impact. The upstream detachment hit the Tyrell left from behind at the same moment. The Tyrell line did not shatter. Shattering was for armies that ran. The Tyrells were too well trained and too proud for that. What the Tyrell line did was fold. The way something folded under pressure that exceeded its design without exceeding its dignity. Piece by piece, flank by flank, as the geometry became undeniable, and the mathematics of 3 attacking forces against a position designed for 1 made itself felt in the blood and the ground. Disciplined men realizing they were inside a trap they had not seen until the door closed behind them, and choosing, in that realization, to fight their way out rather than accept it. Most of them did not fight their way out. The Lannister cavalry in the ford felt at the moment the pressure behind them stopped being empty air. The infantry in the shallows in front of them had not broken. The infantry was an anvil, well held, absorbing the charge without giving. The hammer was somewhere behind them. They were between. Grey wind went through the chaos on the north bank like smoke through an open window. Robb had not ordered it. The wolf moved on its own terms, and its terms in a battle were what they always were, toward him. The soldiers near the direwolf's path moved away from it without deciding to, something older than thought operating faster than thought. The ford turned red. Sir Kevan Lannister was surrounded on the northern bank in the second hour of the rout, cut off from his command by northern horse on 3 sides, and the trident on the 4th, with 4 of his household guard still on their feet, and the rest on the ground. He sat his horse and looked at the situation with the eyes of a man who had been a soldier his entire life and understood the precise moment at which continued assessment served no purpose. He reversed his sword, the blade face down. He held it out from his body. "For my king," Kevan Lannister said, and in the expectation that the boy understands what a yielded sword means. The northern captain who received it was 24 years old, born in Flint's Finger, and had heard of Sir Kevan Lannister. He accepted the surrender with the formality it deserved. "The king will be informed," he said. He was. The field belonged to Robb by dusk. Not cleanly. Nothing was clean at dusk on a battlefield. The surgeons had been working since midday and would work through the night. Captains' reports came in with numbers: how many had crossed the ford and how many had not come back, how many were alive and would remain so with care, and how many were alive and would not make it to morning regardless of care. Northern men. River lords, men who had survived the Whispering Wood and Oxcross, and the long miles in between, and had given their last stretch of road to the Trident. Robb rode through the ford at the hour when the light went amber and the shadows reached across the water. The Trident came to his horse's fetlocks, cold, running fast. He looked down at it. The rubies were long gone, collected the morning after Robert's battle, and scattered across 17 years of trades and inheritances and the ordinary dispersal of things that no longer had a dynasty to belong to. But the ford ran the same color as its name in the dying light, the particular red that water carried when too much had happened on a riverbank in a single day. He sat his horse in the middle of the crossing and looked at the far bank. His father had been at the Battle of the Trident 17 years ago. Not at this exact crossing. The fighting had stretched across miles of river that day. And where Ned Stark's blade had met Lannister steel in that campaign was its own question the stories had never fully answered. But the river was the same water, the same stones, the same ford where the old dynasty had ended, and the new one had been written in blood and rubies. Ned Stark had fought on the winning side and gone south, and the world had become the shape it was. Now his son was standing in the ford going north. Going home. Grey Wind stood in the shallows beside him, looking south, toward King's Landing, toward everything that was not yet finished. The wolf was still. The river moved around his legs without appearing to notice him. Robb sat there for a moment with the water and the last light and the weight of the day. Then he turned back to his camp and dictated the Raven. It was addressed to the hand of the king, the Red Keep, King's Landing. No preamble, no argument. The ford is mine, the road is mine. I will knock before I come in. He sealed it and sent it into the dark. 3 days after the Ruby Ford, Robb's main force was on the King's Road going south in full view of every Lannister crow and border rider within 50 miles. 10,000 men, banners raised, drums carrying across the hills in the particular way that armies announced themselves when announcement was the point. The word would reach King's Landing in 5 days. Tywin would hear it in 4. Robb Stark was on the King's Road. He was 2 weeks from the capital. The defenses of King's Landing had begun preparing for a siege. Robb was in a farmhouse 20 miles west of the road, reviewing a map of the Westerlands. The rider from the south arrived while he was eating, a fast-ridden man, rode dirty, carrying a sealed message from the cavalry detachment that had left the twins 6 weeks earlier. Robb read it once. He set it on the table beside his bread, because bread did not change based on news and he had not finished eating. The message said Jaime Lannister was in northern custody. The capture had not been violent. The detachment had intercepted a traveling party on the road from Harrenhal to the Crownlands, a man in Lannister armor, missing a hand. Accompanied by a large woman in traveling clothes who identified herself as Brienne of Tarth. When the captain confirmed, at the woman's request, that Lady Catelyn Stark was alive and unharmed, Brienne of Tarth had looked at Jaime Lannister for a long moment and said something the captain did not hear clearly. Then, she told him they would go wherever he needed them to go. She said she had a debt to honor. Robb finished his bread. Then, he looked at the map. The Westerlands lay to the west. The Gold Road cut through the hills toward the coast, toward the great rock that sat above the sunset sea on its stone foundations that no army in Westerosi history had broken. Tywin had pulled the garrison to reinforce King's Landing because no army marched on Casterly Rock when the capital was the obvious prize. It was what generals did. It was what the geography encouraged. It was what the road suggested and what every precedent supported. It was the move Tywin had prepared for. "How many men does the Rock have?" Robb asked his scout captain. "Best estimate, 600, possibly fewer." The garrison march for King's Landing started the same week we crossed the ford. Robb was quiet for a moment. Then, the main force keeps going south. Loud, double-fire camps at night. Outriders up the King's Road in force. I want Tywin scouts counting twice what's there. And us? We ride west. The Westerlands in late autumn were the wrong color for Lannister country. Brown hills, bare vineyards, the famous gold of the region visible only in the size of manors and the width of roads, and the occasional gilt sept donated by a lord who could once afford the gesture, and perhaps still could. Robb moved his 8,000 men off the main roads, and through the hill country, fast. Sending heralds ahead to every castle gate with the same message, he was not here for them. He was here for the Rock, and nothing else. Any lord who stayed inside his walls would find the war passed him by without stopping. The lords of the minor Westerlands houses did the arithmetic and stayed inside their walls. Casterly Rock was exactly what Robb had expected, and somehow more. The natural formation alone was staggering, a mass of gray stone rising from the coast, like something that had decided to become permanent and had been doing so for 1,000 years. The castle had not been built on top of the rock. It had been built into it, carved from it, grown out of it over centuries, until the line between the natural and the constructed was no longer visible to anyone who had not been watching from the beginning. Walls that were walls, windows that were windows, but all of it emerging from the same gray gold stone as the cliff face below. The outer gate was held by 600 men who understood their situation and had decided to make it cost what it could. It cost them 1 day. It cost Robb 80 men. The inner keep was better supplied and better positioned and held 2 days longer. The garrison there were household men, the ones who had been at the Rock longest, who knew every corridor and every choke point, who were fighting for something more personal than a military objective. Robb did not rush them. He had archers on the high points, cavalry at the base approaches, and all the time that 80 dead men had bought him. He used it methodically. He did not enjoy it. On the third morning the Castellan came to the great gate alone. He was a white-haired man in Lannister livery who had served the Rock for the better part of 3 decades, and he carried the castle's household ledger under his arm the way another man might carry a sword, as though the orderly accounting of things was its own form of dignity. He was not armed. He opened the gate himself. "The castle is yours," he said. "I ask only that the servants and the children of the household are treated according to their lack of involvement." "You have my word," Robb said. The old man looked at him, at the 17-year-old with the auburn hair and the gray eyes, at the boy who had taken the Lannister seat at the end of a campaign that had lasted longer than some reigns. Something moved in his face that was not grief exactly and not relief exactly. "I believe you," the old man said. He stepped aside. Robb walked into Casterly Rock's great hall and understood, for the first time, why the Lannisters were the way they were. The hall had not been built. It had been carved, shaped from the living rock over centuries. The natural stone walls rising in their original formation smoothed and dressed and in some places gilded but never fully converted from what the mountain had always been. Gold veins ran through the stone in hairline threads that caught the torchlight and scattered it in fragments across the floor. The ceiling vaulted 60 feet above. Cold stone that had been cold for longer than House Lannister had existed to live beneath it. The table at the center was 30 feet of solid oak. At its head, a chair of heavy dark wood that communicated without stating. Robb walked past it. He did not slow as he passed it. He did not look at it more than once. The way you looked at a thing once to confirm it was what you already knew it was. He walked the full length of the hall and through the door at the far end, and down the stairs that went into the rock itself, following the old castellan and the ledger, into the cold and the smell of old stone and metal. He was not here for the chair. The gold mines of Casterly Rock had been running dry for years. Every lord who had done his reading knew this. The legendary Lannister wealth was a name feeding on its own legend, backed less by current production than by the reputation that 300 years of genuine production had created. A dead instrument backed by the memory of a thing rather than the thing itself. What the vaults held was everything else, not fresh minted coin. 300 years of accumulated plate and jeweled tribute and careful collection and the hoarding instinct of a family that had always understood, somewhere in the part of itself that planned rather than boasted, that the mines would run dry eventually and that the name alone would not be enough. Gifts from 100 vassal lords, tribute from 1,000 transactions. The portable wealth of a family that had governed the richest region in Westeros since before the Targaryens arrived, stored with the patience of people who did not spend what they did not have to. Robb's treasurer gave him a number. Robb looked at him. The treasurer gave him the number again, more slowly, in case volume had been the problem. How much of this funds the siege of King's Landing and pays every man in this army through winter? Robb asked. The treasurer indicated roughly a third. Robb looked at the remaining 2/3. He was quiet for long enough that the treasurer began to wonder whether he was supposed to offer a suggestion. The rest goes to Braavos, to the Iron Bank, with a letter. He thought for a moment. Brief letter, addressed from the King of the North and the Trident. It says that the Lannisters cannot pay their debts. It says the North can. It asks what a new relationship might look like. The treasurer had the parchment out before Robb finished the sentence. The Raven reached King's Landing 4 days later. Tywin received it in the small council chamber during a discussion about wildfire stores and the harbor approach. He read it once, folded it, and set it on the table. The discussion about wildfire continued for approximately 30 seconds before stopping. The men around the table had spent enough time near Tywin Lannister to understand the difference between the stillness he projected as management and the stillness that arrived when he had received information that required processing beyond the immediate. They could not have said what the difference was exactly. They felt it. He said nothing for a long time. He had made Casterly Rock in the way men made things they inherited rather than built, not with his hands but with his attention, his judgment, his decisions over decades about what the seat of his house should mean and how it should function and what it should project about the name it carried. He had left it for wars and returned to it between wars. He had used it as the fixed point around which everything else moved. He had buried Joanna in the sept above the harbor and gone back to work from its halls. He had governed the 7 kingdoms from its correspondence rooms and fought the Mad King from its gates and rebuilt the Lannister name from its counting houses. He had not planned to lose it. He had not planned, specifically for a 17-year-old who understood that the obvious prize was a trap and the real prize was the thing everyone assumed was safe. The harbor discussion was still proceeding around him, cautiously, the way conversations continued, when the most important participant had gone somewhere else. Tywin looked at his hands on the table. "Bring me Kevin's ransom terms," he said. No one around the table remarked on what this meant. They did not need to. They understood it the way they understood most things in that chamber, completely, and without saying so aloud. The arrangement with Stannis Baratheon had taken 3 weeks to negotiate and had never, at any point, felt like trust. Davos Seaworth had built it, the former smuggler who served as Stannis' hand and translator, the man who could take what Stannis intended to say and render it into something the other party could hear without immediately refusing it. He had written 4 letters. Robb had written 3. What the exchange produced was not an alliance. It was a geometric agreement, 2 lines meeting at a single point on a map. King's Landing's walls. On a morning both parties named in advance, and neither would break, because breaking it served neither. Stannis attacked from the sea. Robb attacked from the north. The Iron Throne question was deferred to a council of lords after the walls fell. Neither party had agreed on what after looked like. They had agreed, with considerable precision, on what happened today. Robb had met Stannis once before the assault, a single meeting on a grey beach below Dragonstone, 2 men's guards keeping respectful distance while the sea worked at the rocks behind them. Stannis was exactly what the years of correspondence had suggested, harder than the world. Inflexible not from stubbornness, but from a genuine inability to identify what bending would be for. "I want the throne," Stannis had said, without preamble. "You are aware of this." "I am," Robb had said. "If you take the city and install a council and exclude me from it, I will regard that as an act of war. And if you take the city and sit the throne without a council," Robb had said, "I will regard that as a different problem. We know what we disagree about. We should take the city first and disagree about it then, when we have time to do it properly." Something had shifted in Stannis's face that was not warmth and not quite respect, but was in the vicinity of both. "You're practical for your age," Stannis had said. "I'm practical for my circumstances," Robb said. They shook hands on the arrangement. Neither smiled. The truce held, as truces built from mutual necessity held precisely, and for exactly as long as the walls were the common goal. The narrator understood. Even if the parties did not say it aloud, the moment those walls fell, the arrangement entered a different phase, and no one had mapped that phase yet. The assault began at first light. No drums, no banners, no announcement. Robb had used announcement for the Westerlands. What he wanted from King's Landing was speed, and the confusion that came from a city whose outer defense had expected the arrival and found itself unready for the actuality of it. The northern walls held 2 hours. The garrison was what remained after the Ruby Ford had broken the Tyrell cavalry, and the Westerlands raid had pulled the Lannister reinforcements west, men who fought with the particular desperation of soldiers defending the last thing available to them, which was a kind of courage that deserved acknowledgment even as it was being overcome. They dropped stone and arrow on ladders and on men climbing in the growing light. Robb's casualties accumulated in the cold morning, northern men and river lords paying the final toll of a long march. He had given the order before the assault, standing before his captains in the pre-dawn: no burning, no harm to those who surrendered, no revenge against the small folk for crimes committed by lords who had used the city as a shield. What he was here for was the Red Keep. The discipline that held the line between a legitimate army and a sack was the discipline that made him different from the men he was displacing. His captains held it. The gate fell at the second hour. Not broken, opened from within, by defenders who had done the arithmetic and found the sum, did not favor dying for a throne that belonged to a bastard. Grey wind entered King's Landing through the northern gate at a walk, at Robb's left, and the people watching from windows and doorways reached immediate conclusions about their immediate futures. In the harbor, Stannis's fleet had been in position before dawn. The ships were stripped to fighting weight, every plank carrying only what a warship needed. They came into the bay in the grey light before the northern assault, Davos Seaworth navigating the approach with the unhurried precision of a man who had been moving ships through difficult water since before most of Stannis's captains were born. The harbor chain was raised against them. The wildfire did not come. The stores had been relocated during Tywin's fortification preparations weeks earlier, moved to a secured position beneath the Red Keep that required a specific authorization chain to access, an authorization chain that required Tywin's direct order, and Tywin's attention in the final hours of the battle was occupied entirely elsewhere. In the chaos of 2 simultaneous assaults from different directions, with the garrison command fragmenting under pressure, no one with the authority to release the stores could be reached before the harbor chain broke. The chain held for 4 minutes before the lead ship's reinforced hull sheared it at the connection point, which was not. As Davos had noted in his briefing from personal knowledge of harbor approaches, the chain's strongest section. Ships landed. Stannis's men moved into the dock district with the controlled efficiency of soldiers serving a commander for whom inefficiency was a personal offense. King's Landing was being entered from two directions. The defense that had been built for one direction was not sufficient. Joffrey was at the window of the throne room when the northern wall fell. He had been watching the smoke since the assault began. He was 14 years old, and he had been told all his life that the Red Keep was impregnable, and that Lannister forces were the finest in the realm, and that the crown was his by right and by blood. And the morning was arranging itself in direct contradiction of all three of those facts simultaneously. "Bring me my armor," he said. "And my crossbow. I'll go to the walls," Cersei said. "No." He turned from the window with the expression he used when the world declined to arrange itself correctly. "I am the king. I command. You are my son," Cersei said. The particular flatness in her voice silenced him more effectively than the argument. "You are standing at a window watching your city being taken, and you want to go to the walls with a crossbow. You will not. You will stay here. You're a coward. Your father's city is burning," she said. "It burned before, and we survived it. We will survive this." She was wrong. She did not know that yet. She said it as a truth, the way she said all of her truths, absolutely, and from the particular courage of a woman who had never allowed herself to believe in the possibility of the end. She was wrong. She left Joffrey at the window and went to collect her last useful piece. Sansa had known something was different before she heard the first sounds from outside the walls. She had learned the Red Keep by its sounds the way prisoners learned their cells, not fondly, but completely. When servants moved wrong, when guards pulled from posts they always held, when the quality of haste entered the corridors that no ordinary morning produced. She had dressed. She had sat in her chair. She had waited with the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was the only action available to her and had gotten very good at it. Cersei came herself, which confirmed everything. The Queen entered with the composed urgency of a woman activating a plan she had been holding in reserve for weeks. There was a ship, she said. A private arrangement, a harbor approach, not yet compromised. "If Sansa came now, I'll wait here," Sansa said. Cersei's eyes ran the calculation. "You don't understand what's coming. I understand it completely," Sansa said. Her voice was even. She had learned how to make her voice even in this building from watching a woman who had not yet found a reason to leave. Cersei left. Sansa heard her in the corridor, moving fast toward the throne room. She stayed in her chair. The soldiers arrived through the servants' passage behind her room, moving with the confidence of people who had been told exactly where to go and had been given, by someone who knew, the route to get there. Arya was behind them. She stood in the doorway of the servants' passage in the way she stood in all doorways, slightly to the side. Eyes moving across the room before her feet crossed the threshold. She was 11 years old, and she had the look of someone who had memorized this building at a time when her life had required memorizing it. Sansa looked at her sister standing in the servants' corridor in the middle of the fall of King's Landing. "How did you know that passage?" "I found it following a cat," Arya said. "A long time ago. Before everything." A pause. Her eyes found Sansa's and held them. Robb's at the north gate. The soldiers moved. The corridor was narrow and purposeful, and the direction was out. Sansa rose from the chair she had been sitting in for months and followed her sister through the wall. Joffrey was found in the same tunnel network 40 minutes later. Having entered through the wine cellar entrance and encountered soldiers coming the opposite direction with the unhurried certainty of people who had been shown the route by someone who knew every junction. He was in partial armor, poorly fitted in the haste of it, carrying a crossbow and the particular outrage of a boy who had been told his entire life that the world's fundamental orientation was toward his benefit. The soldiers brought him out into the courtyard, still insisting on the injustice of his circumstances. He was 14 years old and not injured. He was brought before Robb Stark in the northern courtyard, and he did not stop talking until he saw the wolf. Grey Wind looked at him from 6 feet away with the disinterested attention a wolf gave to things it had already assessed and found unthreatening. Joffrey went quiet. In the throne room, Tywin Lannister was standing when the doors opened. He had not fled, had not armed himself, had not arranged any contingency beyond this exact posture in this exact room, erect, composed, the last expression of consistency from a man who had been consistent for 57 years and had no intention of becoming something different at the end of it. Cersei stood beside him, not cowering, not performing, standing beside her father in the room where everything had been decided, because there was nowhere else to go and because she was, whatever else she was, her father's daughter. The Iron Throne sat behind them, black iron blades cold in the morning light, indifferent to everything that had been done in its name across 300 years. Robb's men came through the doors, and the throne behind the two Lannisters caught the light without caring who was looking at it. Robb entered last. He looked at Tywin Lannister across the length of the throne room. He looked at Cersei. He looked at the throne. He did not approach the throne. He said, "It's over." Tywin said nothing. But he knew. He had known since Casterly Rock. He had known since he asked for Kevin's ransom terms. He looked at Robb Stark standing in his grandson's throne room and said nothing. And his silence was the only form of acknowledgement available to a man who had never once said "I surrender" and was not going to start. The soldiers moved into the room, and the war was over. He brought a chair from a side room. Not a ceremonial chair, a plain wooden chair, the kind used by castle stewards and household maesters, sturdy and entirely without statement. He placed it in the center of the Red Keep's great hall, in front of the Iron Throne but not near it, and he sat in it and held court. The Iron Throne stayed where it had always been. Its black iron blades caught the morning light from the high windows and scattered it. No one sat in it. No one referred to it. It was the hall's largest piece of furniture and functionally invisible. Tywin Lannister was brought before him first. He had spent the night in the same cells where Ned Stark had spent his final weeks, which was not a symbolic choice on Robb's part, and was noted by everyone regardless. He came into the hall unchained. Robb had ordered that, walking with the posture of a man who had decided that, whatever happened this morning, it would happen to him on his feet and in his own character. The trial was brief because the evidence required no argument. The intercepted letter, copied and distributed to every lord in the realm months before the army reached the capital. The testimonies of the Bolton riders who had confirmed the conspiracy before their own fates were determined. The documented facts of the purge of the twins, guest right violated at the instigation of a man who had never stood within those walls, but whose handwriting was on the instruction. Tywin made his defense without flinching. He said, governing a realm required decisions that could not be made gently. He said, the Stark rebellion had destabilized the Seven Kingdoms, and he had moved to end it. He said, the methods were what the methods were, and history would weigh them against the alternative. He said all of this with the precision of a man who had prepared the argument and believed it and was under no illusion that it would save him. Robb listened to all of it. Your history ends here, he said. The execution was carried out in the courtyard of the Red Keep, in the northern manor. A single blade, the lord who passes the sentence swinging the steel himself, the way Ned Stark had always done it, the way it had always been done in the north where the man who pronounced the judgment did not hand its doing to another. The courtyard was quiet. It did not take long. Joffrey's case took longer to decide. He was 14. He had ordered Ned Stark's death and shown cruelty at every opportunity his short life had provided, and both of those things were true and documented and witnessed. He was also 14, raised by a mother who had turned him into a weapon and a grandfather who had turned everything around him into a calculation, and the question of what a 14-year-old owed for the sins of the childhood he had been given was not a question Robb resolved cleanly. He did not execute Joffrey. He stripped him of every title the boy had ever held, declared the Baratheon Lannister succession invalid on grounds the entire realm had been sent the evidence to understand, and placed him in the citadel at Old Town under a maester's ongoing care. He will live, Robb told his captains when several of them expressed the predictable concern. He just won't rule. History can decide whether that was mercy or wisdom. Robb had decided it was both, and he was aware that the deciding was itself a kind of judgment he would have to carry. Cersei Lannister was remanded to the custody of the faith. Not the Silent Sisters entirely, she had argued against that, quietly and with the dignity she seemed to produce most reliably when everything else had been taken from her. The arrangement reached was Casterly Rock under guard. With the faith's oversight, her children Myrcella and Tommen removed to separate households where they would be raised without the political game that had shaped their mother. They were innocent. They would be treated as such. Tyrion, who had provided more useful intelligence about Lannister operations than any other source in the campaign, sat in a side chamber awaiting the determination of his own case. That determination, Robb told Davos Seaworth, was its own conversation for its own time. A man who had spent his life being used by his family and had chosen, when the moment came, to do otherwise, deserved something more considered than a morning's judgment. The lords assembled in the hall that afternoon. Some of them wanted to crown him. The Tyrells were generous about it. There was a political logic to it that Mace Tyrell could see clearly and had been discussing with his advisors. Several Riverlords said so explicitly. He had won the war. He was standing in the Red Keep. The throne was 40 feet behind him, and the hall was full of men who had fought under his banner. Robb said no. Not as a performance, not with the speech that the moment might have invited. He just said no. "I am the king in the north in the trident," he said. "I am not the king of the 7 kingdoms. I do not want to be. The 7 kingdoms need a council, not another king from a great house who will spend a generation bleeding the realm to hold it." What he proposed, outlined in a document his council had been drafting across the previous 3 weeks, was not a democracy. Westeros was not ready for what that word implied, and Robb knew it. It was a structured council, lords representing each region, a rotating position of Chief Justice to arbitrate disputes, decisions of realm-wide significance requiring a quorum of regional voices rather than a single crown. Imperfect, contentious, better than the alternative. He had modeled it partially on the only institution in Westeros he had ever seen actually function on something like shared decision-making, the Night's Watch. An organization that had endured 8,000 years not because it was just, but because it required its members to be present to the problem rather than to their own advancement. Stannis Baratheon was present for this proposal. He had been present for it in silence since Robb began speaking, which in Stannis was not assent, but the particular quiet of a man choosing his response carefully. When Robb finished, Stannis said, "This is not what I agreed to. You agreed to a council of lords deciding the shape of what comes after. That is what this is. I agreed to a claim heard and weighed. My claim has not been heard." "Your claim will be heard by the council," Robb said, "with every other claim, on its merits. My claim is the Iron Throne," Stannis said. "Not a seat on a council of lords who cannot agree on the price of grain." The room was very still. "Then you'll have to wait until the council can hear you," Robb said, "or you won't. That is your choice, and I won't make it for you." Stannis looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the Iron Throne behind Robb's plain wooden chair. He looked at the hall full of lords who had just watched a 17-year-old decline something every other man in the room would have taken. He said nothing further. He left for Dragonstone that evening with his fleet and his hand and his claim intact and unresolved. And that unresolved thing was the seed of something no one in that hall could afford to ignore for long. But that was not today's problem. Sansa found him that evening in a side room off the main hall, reviewing a map of the Riverlands, with the particular focus of a man who had been reviewing maps for so long that it had become a form of rest. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She was wearing clean clothes for the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate, Tully blue, taken from a chest of Catelyn's things that had been stored in the Red Keep, and which fit her now differently than it would have when she arrived here as a girl. She looked at him. He looked like her brother. He also looked like someone who had been through 10 chapters of something that aged a person without aging their face, which was the particular way that war changed people who survived it. "I used to think you'd come," she said. "I did come," he said. She nodded. There was nothing else to say, and at the same time, a great deal. The narrator leaves them there. The march north began 10 days later. The army that moved up the King's Road was not the same army that had moved down it. It was larger, composed of northern men and riverlords, and a contingent of Westerlanders who had found reasons to serve a king who was going home rather than settling into a throne. And it was tired in the deep way that only long-campaigned soldiers were tired, not from yesterday's march, but from all the marches. Accumulated weight that no single night's rest could lift. Robb rode at the front. Talisa beside him. The baby came 3 weeks into the march, in a village outside the Neck, delivered by the army's senior maester in a farmhouse with thick walls and a fire that had been burning since before they arrived. A healthy boy. The labor was long. Talisa did not complain about it, which was entirely in character. They named him Ned. Robb held the boy in the farmhouse while the fire burned, and the army camped outside in the dark. And the name sat in his chest with the weight of everything it carried, every promise, every lie told in protection, every death that had been the cost of the world this child was being born into. Catelyn wrote 3 letters on the march, one to her sister Lysa at the Eyrie, an accounting of what had happened, what had survived, what required attention. One to the family of every Stark man who had died in the war, a letter she had started composing in her head at the Twins and had been building ever since, the particular work of acknowledging that the victory had not been free and that the price had been paid by people who deserved to be named. The 3rd letter she addressed to Castle Black. To Jon Snow. Its contents she kept private. What it said between what it said, anyone who had watched Catelyn Tully Stark across this story could guess at. What it said directly, she owed him in her own words. Winterfell was rubble. The Boltons had stripped what they could use and left what they couldn't, and the Ironborn had done the particular damage that people did when they wanted to leave a mark on a place rather than simply occupy it. The great towers still stood. The curtain wall was intact in most places. The godswood was exactly as it had always been, the weirwood at its center unchanged, patient, the red sap running in the cracks of its carved face like something the cold had not yet reached. The great hall had been cleared. Someone, Crannogman or northern smallfolk, or both, had laid a fire in the hearth that was burning when the column arrived. Jon Snow rode south from Castle Black the moment the Raven reached him. 100 miles. 4 days of hard riding. He arrived at Winterfell on the first evening of Robb's return, when the sun was going down behind the western walls, and the fire in the great hall was the warmest light in the ruin. The brothers stood in the courtyard, not immediately embracing, not yet. The distance of the courtyard between them, and the larger distance of everything that had happened between the boys they had been and the men looking at each other now across the cold stone. Jon had not aged the way Robb had aged. He had aged differently. The wall did that. "I got your letter," Jon said. "I thought you would," Robb said. They held the distance for one more moment. Then they closed it, and the embrace was the embrace of people who had not believed they would have it again and had not let themselves know how much they had needed it until the moment it arrived. Grey wind pressed against both of them, warm in the cold evening, and did not move. The north was free. It had always been cold and full of whispers, whispers of old wars and old gods and old grudges that never fully died. But it was free. And for one winter, standing in the ruins of their father's hall, 2 brothers who shared no blood but every memory let themselves believe the cold was just cold, and the whispers were just wind. The spring would come. The wall still stood, and somewhere beyond it, in the dark and the ice, something older than Starks or Lannisters or Kings was watching and waiting. But that was another story. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.